Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucilla and Jenny, for having me along. And it's really nice to have the chance to come along and talk today for this workshop. And what I want to do is just try and make the case for exploring learning spaces through sound. And I suppose the first thing to say is that obviously the term learning space supports a range of different conceptualizations, and what I'm interested in today is thinking about primarily about physical spaces, and although most of my research and the examples I'll use are centered within higher education, just because that's the field, the space that I work in, I think many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about actually could apply to a range of different learning spaces. So from my point of view, a learning space is any setting where educational activity is performed or happens. So it's the design studio, it's the lecture theatre, it's the school classroom, it's the playground, but it's also the museum, the gallery, the hospital ward, sitting at home on the couch, commuting on the train journey. These are all learning spaces, and as we'll see during the course of the presentation, we'll explore some of these different spaces as we go along. So to begin, I suppose some questions for you, and it would be that, while writing or reading an academic paper, do you ever just, pause to listen to your surroundings? Or in the classroom, have you ever taken a moment to consider the soundtrack that accompanies the performance of teaching and learning? Have you ever played back an interview recording and instantly become aware of different oral phenomena that wasn't apparent at the time of delivering the interview? Today's session is really all about that kind of thing. It's a call to critically tune into our sonic surroundings as a way of interrogating the different spaces where teaching and learning happen. And to do this, I'm going to talk about some examples of emergent research and some original methods, including some of my own, where I've used sound to provide insights into classroom power dynamics, into learner rituals, into the influence of digital technologies, and also assumptions about pedagogy and the nature of knowledge itself. And I'm going to describe how audio recordings help us to hear the unseen. I'm going to talk about how journaling and sonic elicitation methods can help us to explore learning spaces that it might not be feasible or ethical to actually visit in person. And from there, I'm going to talk about a recent piece of work, something I'm developing right now, which is whether we can use music playlists as a way of exploring learning spaces and practices. Now, before going any further, I should point out that I don't have any formal training in sound. So whilst I have an interest in sound and I've read around the subject and I've experimented, I don't have a background within audio. And the reason I'm making this point is that I don't see that as being a barrier to working with sound in education research, within social research and learning spaces research, any more than we should expect someone using visual methods to have some kind of formal training in photography or art. So that's the position I'm coming from today. And Martin, you said at the start that you have a background in audio, so you might be able to pick up on gaps in my knowledge and put me right as we go along. So anyway, it's lovely to have the chance to speak to you today. And as we're going along, please do feel free to put comments into the chat. And I think Jenny and Lucilla are going to kindly have a look at that, and then I'll have some opportunity for conversation later on. So I'm going to be interested to see what you think of some of the ideas I'll put forward. So I'll maybe talk for maybe less than 40 minutes, I think, but maybe half an hour, and then we'll have time for just discussion. And I'm interested to hear what you think. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Lucia? So I suppose a good place to begin is to talk about exactly what we understand sound to be. And on the slide there, I've got some interpretations of sound from different people working in this kind of space. And I'll return to Shafe and to Sarasa's work at different points during the presentation part of the session. But, sound is many different things. It's the vibrational movement of energy through air and matter, but it's also a way of conveying emotion and meaning through spoken word and song. Sound is art to be savoured, but it's also noise to be abated. And the presence and significance of sound reverberates across cultural contexts and disciplinary boundaries, but as well as across time and space. And sonic practices and properties are the concern of architects and astronomers, medics, musicologists, physicists and poets, and many others. And from my point of view, sound is really inextricably linked to our meaning-making practices. It enables us to establish relationships and act power, to construct space, which obviously I'll be talking about today. And it helps us to make sense of our surroundings, and also, I guess, to make sense of the invisible as well. But what we're particularly interested in today is the sounds that shape our different learning spaces. And I opened the session by asking whether, when reading or writing or performing another educational activity, if you just stop and listen, and not just pausing whilst writing a paragraph for a break, but instead halting your activity with a specific purpose of tuning into your surroundings. And that's something I'd like us to do now as a first activity. And it's what's called an ear cleaning activity, which was used by the sound scholar Murray Schafer. And so for the next minute, what I would like you to do is just to focus on what you hear. You might choose to close your eyes if you want to do that. I find that can be helpful. But I will stop speaking for a minute, and I just want you to stop and listen and take into account all the different things you can hear, starting from, get my timer, just starting from now. I think that's about a minute. And what I'd like you to do now is, if you could put into the chat any of the different sounds that you heard during that last minute or so. I've always really enjoyed doing this activity, and this activity was really developed by Murray Schafer and his colleagues at Simon Fraser University as part of the World Soundscape Project. And I've always been struck whenever I've done this activity is really focusing on sound, which is something we don't always tend to do. You become aware of just a wider range of sound that are helping to define our learning spaces. And there are really interesting examples of what can come out. And I know that I was reading through there, and somebody had mentioned being able to hear their own body. And there's fascinating instances of researchers working in anechoic chambers within university audio departments, and going into this space where you can actually hear your own body. You can hear the movement of blood through the body, and I think it's really fascinating because it just removes this idea of the possibility of silence that we might find quite desirable. And so this type of approach was developed by Murray Schafer and colleagues, and it was about, he described it as cleaning our ears, trying to remove the oral sludge from our surroundings. And what it helps us to do is to establish what was called a soundscape. And so, Lucilla, if you could just move on to the next slide there. And the soundscape is a way of referring to the different sounds that you might have within a particular setting. And it's become really quite popular in a range of different research fields as a way of trying to take into account our oral surroundings, which we can often tend to overlook. And so applied to a learning spaces context, we can have the sound space of a lecture theatre or the school playground or the museum or the gallery. And these different kinds of sounds helped us to make sense of our surroundings and help to define that particular space. But as I'm going to talk about, I think they can also reveal a great deal more. And one of the interesting things about sound and about listening is that we're always listening, and Schafer says the first thing you do in the morning is actually you hear sound because we don't have earlids. And something I'm quite interested in is the idea of the cocktail party effect, which Cherry developed or proposed. And you might have heard this phrase before, and I guess a good way of describing it is that if you imagine you're at an academic conference and you're having a conversation with another delegate, but then someone in another part of the room mentions your name or your research or your subject, and straight away your interest is displaced from the conversation you're having with this delegate who you're no longer really focusing on, and you're actually transported somewhere else. And it's because our ears have the ability to pass different sounds simultaneously. But what that means is I think from a learning spaces perspective is very interesting, is that we can talk about a particular learning space having its own soundscape, but in actual fact we all hear uniquely due to our physiology, but we also hear based upon our personal interests and our personal history. And so I suppose the conference drinks reception is a good example of that, is that we are actually hearing things differently. So I think we have to be careful of assuming that spaces all have a common sound, because everyone hears sound slightly differently. Nevertheless, the idea of the soundscape I think is very helpful for us as we think about learning spaces, because it encourages us to look at not just at activity or what we can see, but also what we can hear as well. Lucilla, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Now, obviously, there are many different ways of exploring space and learning spaces, and I've just drawn attention to a few examples here. And we have, just for instance, Randall Monty has used interviews and conversation as a way of exploring how learners help to use mobile learning technologies to establish place. Observation is used by Johnson and Koo, and I don't know, Elaine, whether that's your research or not. So
no,
I won't
sorry,
talk.
I can't claim
It's not.
credit to that.
Okay, it just struck me when I saw your name. So so Johnson and Koo used observation because it won't always be possible to sit down and talk to people, and sometimes we want to use ethnographic methods. So Johnson and Koo do a combination of they bring together architectural expertise and ethnographic observation to look at how people interact around objects within layouts. Leslie Gorley and Martin Oliver have used journaling as a way of trying to tap into different learning spaces. And as I'll come on to talk about, journaling can be very helpful in terms of looking at spaces that we can't visit in person. And these and other approaches often use visual methods. We use maps, we use image elicitation. There's a range of different ways of exploring learning spaces. But what's tended to be under-considered in the exploration of learning spaces, I think, is sound. Lucilla, if you could move on to the next slide, please. And there are different ways of conceptualizing space as well. So we've got methods, but these and other methods are are supported by or underpinned by different kinds of theories. And what I've done here is just given examples of different learning spaces studies by Leandro et al., by Mellowish, by Mulcahy, and by Boys that have drawn on different theoretical work around the concept of space. So Lefebvre's spatial triad, Bourdieu's habitus, but in particular sociomateriality has been very popular as a way of interrogating learning spaces, particularly looking towards the influence and the effects of digital technologies. But what sociomateriality does, I think, is very helpful, is it allows us to take into account the human aspect of the learning space, but also the non-human, the objects, the light, the table, all these other sorts of things, and of course, including within that, sound. Thanks, Cecilia. But sound has tended to exist on the margins of social research, and I suppose we can say that since the advent of the printing press and the Gutenberg press around the 1500s in the university towns of Paris and Bologna and Oxford, print, the visual, has been the main means for the most part of conveying knowledge rather than sound. And sound is still, to an extent, on the margins of social education research. However, I think there are really interesting opportunities, and I think what we're beginning to see, helped through the possibilities of digital technologies, which have made it considerably easier to work with sound, we're beginning to see sound becoming more prominent in education research and social research, and to an extent also as a way of interrogating our learning spaces. Next slide, please, Priscilla. And most recently, we've begun to see some really interesting examples of what sound brings to the study of learning spaces. And so Walter Gershon, who based in an American university, has been particularly prominent in helping to make the case for using sound in education and social and learning spaces research, kind of makes that point that we're now beginning to see sound realizing its potential. And Steph Sarasso, who's based, I think, at the University of Pittsburgh, has done some really interesting work. She does work around sound and multimodal composition, but she also looks at what sound can tell us about our learning surroundings as well. And two recent studies that I found really interesting, and this was from a special issue that Jenny and Lucilla and I worked on around post-digital learning spaces. Stephanie Wilson from Sydney University did a really interesting study where she proposed that we can use musical representation as a way of helping us to design learning spaces, which I just thought was fabulous. And Katie Ahern raises a really interesting question about the possibility of, as teachers, should we be trying to actively shape online spaces through planting sounds? She uses the phrase planting sounds. So let's accept that our learning activities are shaped by our sonic surroundings. Well, when we go into hybrid or when we go into online spaces, what should we be doing as educators to try and shape the surroundings in the online way, in the same way that we might pay attention in the physical classroom to, preventing competing noises from outside or trying to create the nice ambience. So Katie Ahern raises the question of, can we be planting sounds in online spaces to try and nurture particular conditions for learning? So I think there's some really interesting work that's taking place. So we're beginning to see this recognition that, okay, sound can really help us in our ways of thinking about what learning spaces are and what learning spaces can be, and the kinds of activities that can take place within different kinds of learning environments. Lucilla, thank you. And so that moves us on to some of the methods that I want to talk about today. So I've acknowledged there's interesting work going on within sound and learning spaces, and I want to now reflect on 3 examples, albeit the work I do is drawn on other people's work, of course. And the first of these, the first one is actually 2 different approaches, and it involves field recording and the mapping of sound. And so field recording, I suppose in its simplest form, is a way of capturing through audio our surroundings. And we tend to think of field recordings often as going out to the natural world, but I think field recording can be equally valuable within a range of settings, and that includes within learning spaces, within the classroom, whatever the classroom might be. And I think what has made field recording much more accessible to us as educators and researchers have been the recent advances in digital technologies. A little while ago, within my university at Edinburgh, we have in our kind of archive area, there was a display of work from anthropologists and ethnographers, and it had their kit. And it was relatively recently, it was still the case that my colleagues in the university would have been going out to field sites with really cumbersome audio recorders with tapes and reels and really heavy things. Where now with a device like this, a fairly standard smartphone, we now have a device that enables us to, at the swipe of a screen or click of a few buttons, we can record audio, we can save it, we can share it, we can edit it. So it's now much, much easier for us as researchers to be working with sound. We no longer need to have a high level of expertise or a great deal of expensive equipment. So things have become a great deal more accessible for us. And field recording is made possible through that. And you can use a mobile phone. I've got a dedicated device, an audio recorder, and the benefit of using something like that is it has unidirectional sound. So I'm not just pointing the phone to get sound in one direction, but in the classroom, it gets the things all around me. It gets the things that are unseen, the things that are behind me. But nevertheless, these kinds of devices are really helpful. And moving on to sound maps, well, sound maps, I suppose, in their simplest form are a way of representing particular sounds to physical locations. And that's been done in a number of different ways. And I've suggested some examples on the slide there in case this is something that you would be interested in pursuing. Lucila. And I've included a quote here from a piece of work that I did with two of my colleagues at Edinburgh University, Mark Gallagher and Jeremy Knox. And just to give a bit of context to the study here, on this occasion, the learning space was the street. And we were attending a multimodal methods conference at UCL in London. And rather than delivering a conventional paper, we wanted to make the point that through multimodal approaches, we can better understand our urban surroundings. And so the day before the conference, we travelled down to London, which was taking place in the EC1 postcode of the city, the conference. And we set out to record our surroundings. And we did that with mobile phones, and we did it with cameras, but we also did it with using the voice memo function, the audio function on our phones. And what I've tried to capture in the quote here is just the extent to which the sounds we could hear, by focusing on sound, it really changed our interpretation of our surroundings. And what I'd like to try and do now, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I'll give it a go. I'm going to type in, let's have a look and see. I'm going to type in a video link, and I wonder if, Lucila, I don't know if you're able to show that. I've put it into the chat, so it'll be that first one, EC1. I don't know if you're able to click on that. Yeah, and if we could maybe just watch perhaps just the first a minute or so of the video. Or the first half minute, it'll be fine.
What person I use? Seriously?
Surveys.
All right, so I think it's... let's try it again.
It's playing.
Thanks very much, Lucilla. That's probably enough. I appreciate you playing that. Thank you very much. And the reason I wanted to play this clip was that I think that when we focus very much on what we see, we have an interpretation of our surroundings and in different learning spaces, whether that's the street or the classroom or somewhere else. But I think when we then really focus on what we can hear, and I'm conscious I'm using the word focus, so much of our language is focused on the ocular. But when we try and attend to what we can hear, we can get a different interpretation. And that was really played out in the example I was showing there, where we were at this really busy part of London and there was traffic flying around, and it was it was the commuter time. It was really busy, and then we just happened to hear this piano music, and then we focused our attention on that, and it really changed our interpretation of that particular part of the city, that learning space in that particular moment in time. So I think that's a good example of how sound can add something to what we're seeing, and perhaps even changing our interpretation of it. Thanks, Lucilla. Next slide, please. And this is a photograph from my PhD research, and for a year I observed students in two courses, an American history course, which we see here, but also at the same time an architectural design course. And my PhD was about the way that learning spaces are affected by digital technologies, and I used sound as a major part of that. And so for a year I followed students and staff around all the different spaces, well, most of the different spaces where they would teach and learn, and quite often that involved sitting at the back of a lecture theatre recording sounds. And if we could move on to the next slide, Lucilla. And from there what I did was I mapped those sounds. So this is like a schematic of the same lecture theatre we have here. And across the duration of the year I recorded lots of different sound, and then I worked through them using thematic analysis, and what I wanted to do was try and find a way of representing sound in the different learning spaces. And so what I did was create interactive maps, and I won't show it here, maybe there'll be a wee bit of time later on to do that, but this is an interactive map in ThingLink where by clicking on each particular arrow there, it plays a representative sound from the lecture theatre alongside a corresponding image. And it was a way of me trying to bring together my many field recordings and put it into the learning space to try and reveal the different practices and the different social and different kind of material elements of the class. So it's the field recording and then combined with trying to map it in a particular way. And I did the same thing for the architectural design studio, where I was also doing my research, just as a way of contrast, and it was quite a different kind of representation of sound. Next slide, please, Lucilla. And one of the things to emerge from this approach was the way that sound helps to reveal power dynamics within different classrooms. And so by using mapping and by looking at field recordings in conjunction with other methods, I was able to have a think about what's happening in terms of power within the lecture theatre we saw before there. And at the start of the class, silence would fall over as the lecturer would come in and move towards the lectern, and then the lecturer's voice would be projected by 12 ceiling speakers and 2 AV speakers. It would be projected to every corner of the room. If they decided to step away from the microphone, they had their lavalier, they had their lapel mic. And by contrast, the students didn't have the power of sound. They were, for the most part, silent, they were static, and they were there to listen. And I thought this was really interesting in terms of talking to me about the kind of assumptions about the nature of knowledge and pedagogy in that particular discipline. And of course these history students had to work with the knowledge and they had to interpret the knowledge, but there was a real sense there of the learning space combined with the sonic technologies was essentially enabling the lecturer's voice to spread to every corner of the lecture theatre, and it helped to reveal the assumptions about the nature of knowledge within that particular discipline of the tutor passes down a curated set I don't want to say set of facts, a curated body of knowledge to pass down onto the students who would then work with those materials. Now, in contrast, moving to the architectural design studio, where there weren't these kinds of technologies, there was much more of, I guess, of what you would say constructivist learning space. The tutor would come in and they wouldn't stand behind a lectern, they wouldn't have a microphone, there were no microphones in the learning spaces of the architecture course. The tutor would sit down, therefore, and would sit right in amongst the group or would perch on the table, and there was a completely different type of learning environment. So what sound helped to do there was help to expose some of the power dynamics and the hierarchies associated with those learning spaces, but also with those disciplines in general. So I think sound can tell us a great deal about power relationships and about hierarchy and about epistemology, as I found there. Next slide, please. And moving on to the second method that I want to kind of move through, and this is about journaling and sonic elicitation. It won't always be possible to be physically present in the learning spaces that we might want to explore. So in the case of my own PhD research, and also in research I've done with my colleagues Sian Bain and Michael Gallagher, where we work with online students, we can't physically be present in those spaces to observe and take photographs and make our own recordings. The students I was working with in my PhD research, they would sit in bed, they would work through the night on essays ahead of deadlines the next day. It's like, ethically, it wouldn't have been possible or appropriate for me to be there. And so I and other people have used journaling methods. And I talked about some of Leslie Gawley and Martin Oliver's work before, where they looked at the learning spaces of postgraduate students and they used a journaling method. And what I've used in the past, I suppose, are multimodal postcards, where we've invited students to create postcards of their learning spaces, and that's included maybe taking a photograph, but also recording, making a short sound recording, and then using those as the basis for analysis and trying to learn about their surroundings. So when I did this approach with my colleagues for the first time, we were looking at online students with, as I said, with Sian Bain and Michael Gallagher, but that only gave us a single learning space. And a limitation of that research is that students don't just study in one location. Teaching and learning happens in many different impromptu and transitory and social and domestic spaces, particularly as we've seen during COVID lockdown. And so what I did was I asked students for the duration of a week to record all the different spaces from where they engaged with their course. And I was really open about this. So this could mean that students could be, walking along the street and had a sudden idea for their architectural project. Well, in that point in time, for me, the street became a learning space because it was supporting reflection. It could be the cafe, it could be, it was all sorts of different places. So that approach helped me to generate, I think it was 77 postcards, which then helped to inform my analysis. And what I'd like to do now, I don't suppose it would be possible, Lucila, to maybe try and click the second of those links there, because what I want to do is show how generating sound helps us to gain insights to spaces that we can't necessarily access all that readily. So some of the spaces beyond the campus. I think we'll probably pause it there. Thanks again, Lucila. And what I was doing in that particular the video there, this was a part of my thesis, was to try and capture the many social and domestic spaces that students were enacting their learning beyond the campus. And we can obviously tend to think about learning spaces as being those physical buildings, but through mobile technologies in particular, the flow of data, we're able to see many different spaces. But I think there's a real richness that comes with trying to capture some of the sound as well as the images, and I'll talk about the meaning of some of the sounds in a little while. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Sila? And so this is just, it gives you an indication of what we tried to, some of the ideas that came out of the different approaches of using journaling and sonic elicitation. And I'll probably focus on the second of the quotes there, which is from the PhD research that we were just looking at. And it's just that what this journaling approach helped to show was the way that the conceptual boundaries of the classroom are reconfigured by digital technologies. And so if we'd watched the duration of the video, what would have been really prominent was the presence of music in students' learning spaces. In nearly every instance, not every instance, but nearly every instance where students were in a relatively personal learning space, they turned towards sound to inform their space. And I think this is really interesting, and it's something that I explored in more detail within my research. So I think maybe we'll move on to the next slide, please, Lucilla. And so this is the third thing I want to talk about, and this is from a piece of research that was a part of my PhD, but I'm just making corrections to an article now, so hopefully it will be published soon. And it's making the case for using playlists, music playlists, as a way of exploring learning spaces. And the first point I became aware within my own PhD research of sound on music, being prominent within learning spaces and practices, it wasn't actually through what I was hearing, but it was through looking at photographs that I'd been taken in the architectural design studio, and had this recurring presence of headphones and earphones and the kind of Apple ear white buds. And it was almost as if, the headphones were the technology alongside the pencil and the paper and the laptop computer and the CAD software, because they just seemed to be in every single space. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I want to learn more about this. So I started to speak to students, and then I devised the speculative method where I worked with students from the two courses in history and architectural design to create what we called learning playlists. And I asked them to nominate any songs that they would listen to, and to tell me about the significance. And I then put these into playlists in Mixcloud as a kind of a sharing way of saying thank you for their input. But what this did was to reveal the extent to which students actively sought out music to inform their learning spaces. And this was done in a number of different ways, and quite contrasting ways. So within the architectural design studio, where it was very busy and quite chaotic, and I talked before about it being a quite conversational, constructivist learning space. So a number of students, when they needed to really focus, would put their earphones in, seek out a particular Spotify playlist in order to separate themselves from their immediate surroundings. But in contrast, another member of the group that I worked with, when he was working away from the design studio, he would find it very isolating, very lonely. And so he would then turn to music to try and almost recreate the convivial atmosphere of the design studio. So students use music in a number of different ways to match the particular learning activity, but also to try and nurture particular learning spaces. And I don't think there's anything new, obviously, in students turning towards sound and towards music to create a particular kind of learning ambience. But what I'm particularly interested in is how the streamed music playlist enables students to do this in new ways. And I suppose something that was very interesting for me was that when I was interviewing these students at the end of my research, and I was really amazed by the amount of music that they could have access to through Spotify streaming services. They had access to millions of songs, and they were utterly matter of fact about it. It it was not a big deal to them at all. But of course, what I came to realise was that when I'd been doing the comparable work in the early 1990s, there was only a fixed number of cassettes I could take in my rucksack when I went away to university. If I was going for a long stint of studying in the library, I could probably take one C90 cassette to make do for the whole time. But these students had grown up, I suppose, surrounded by digital technologies, the ability to access vast amounts of music through a mobile device, through a computer, was there a part of their everyday practice. So it wasn't remarkable to them at all, which in itself was very interesting to me. But what it meant for these students was that in almost any setting, they were able to tune into a range of different types of soundtracks to nurture the conditions that were suited for learning. So for the student who's on the train journey and has half an hour to kill, they could seek out a particular type of learning ambience by tuning into a particular Spotify playlist. For the student who was having to work on an essay through the night and was feeling a bit isolated and alone and a bit tired and a bit down, using Spotify, they could change their surroundings into a much more upbeat, happy kind of place. So I think there's something really interesting in that, and that's what I'm just writing about at the moment. Next slide, please, Lucilla. And I will stop soon because I'm conscious of time for conversation. And so what the playlist enables us to do, what music enables us to do, combined with the headphones, is to create what Buller's called an acoustic bubble. And it enables the student to go into their own personalised learning space and to negotiate their own types of learning space in a range of different domestic or social or transitory or academic settings. They can separate themselves from their immediate surroundings if they want to do that. And the next slide, please, Lucilla. And yeah, I suppose the final thing I would say is that beyond the findings that I was able to take out of this particular approach of using the playlist, and I've moved through it very quickly, obviously, but something that was also really interesting was that it helped to establish rapport and trust, and it wasn't something that I'd considered. But up to that point, working with these undergraduate students, they were second-year undergraduates, and I'd found it really hard to connect with them. They'd been very polite and they were willing to get involved in my research to an extent, but it was really clear that I was formerly a member of staff in the university. There was a big age difference. They were much cooler than I was. You know, there was a gap between us. Music almost acted as some common ground, as a hook. And it was interesting that as soon as I asked students to tell me about the music they were listening to, some of the students were immediately much more willing to get involved in my research. And so it was helpful in terms of establishing rapport and trust, which is obviously so important within research and particularly in ethnography. But what the playlist also did is they almost supported a kind of a sonic elicitation method, where when it came to interview, it gave us something else to talk about, the playlist and music and how it informed their learning space. So I'm interested in this idea that playlists can work as ethnographic artifacts because it told me about their rituals, but it helped to establish rapport and trust, but they also worked as a form of sonic elicitation method. And we talk about image elicitation and asking research participants to bring a photograph along, which we then discuss at interview. I don't see why we shouldn't also be doing that with music and other forms of sound, and I think there's rich opportunity there. And so I'll then move on to the final slide, please. And so these are, I suppose, where we might go from here. And I suppose to touch very briefly on the scope of what I've been trying to convey today is that the different methods I've talked about have involved sound, but it's always been in concert with other methods. And earlier on I talked about sound being on the margins and sound perhaps being unable to compete with more oculocentric, more conventional forms of educational and social research. But I don't think we should necessarily see sound as being in competition, but instead sound in concert with other methods. So sound as a part of ethnography, sound within multimodal methods, sound as an elicitation method as a part of a wider qualitative study. But other questions that we might be thinking about, and I think there's lots of ways that sound can talk to us about learning spaces. I'm really interested in how sound within online spaces like this affect power dynamics. You know, whose voices are silenced or amplified when we're in this kind of setting. I'm interested in the idea of, the academic conference where the mic would be passed maybe to a particularly confident senior academic who would then say, well, I've actually got 3 comments and 2 questions and no one else has the chance to speak. And I wonder whether in online, when Lucila has the power to mute me, how does that change the power dynamics? Does this make for more democratic learning spaces? Whose voices are being excluded or amplified when we move into online spaces? And what about working in hybrid learning spaces or fusion learning spaces? And I'm just starting to do this within my own university, teaching students who are simultaneously on campus and online. We're thinking about how we can have eye contact with the 2 different groups simultaneously, but we need to be very careful to attend to the sound, the sonic aspects of those spaces as well. What do we really know about sonic conditions beyond the campus? Universities and other learning organizations spend a considerable amount of time thinking about the right furnishings, the right acoustics for the physical space. But when so much learning is happening online, as Katie Ahern talked about, and I mentioned her research, what do we know about their online sonic conditions? What their spaces in their home spaces, the sound in their home spaces. And what of educators? Research has tended to focus on the sound spaces of learners, but what of teachers? What does it mean for a marker, an educator, to go into a cafe to mark essays where they're surrounded by the sound of conversation and cafe ambience? How is that different? Is it different from that same marker marking those essays within their academic office? What do we know about this? I think there's lots of interesting questions. So thank you everyone for listening today. Hopefully you've come away enthused about the possibility of working with sound in learning spaces research, and I'll be interested to hear any of your thoughts.
Thank you very much, James. I think there's a comment from Jenny.
James, I forget what the Ahern quote was that you had, but when you mentioned it way back, I did wonder about if it would relate to playlists, because we've used them sort of themed to our topic, and it was fabulous. I think. I mean, Marla, you might want to talk about how it's been in our Year 2 class.
I connected with your idea on being perhaps outside the musical genre that many of them listen to. So it was more of an autocratic playlist because, I think everybody should appreciate Deborah Harry's Heart of Glass when we're studying the heart. But it's true. We've not given the opportunity to, they really enjoy that space, but we've just used it sort of as a filler of we're still here, as opposed to it being dead air. So there's definitely space to grow. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just also thinking about an interesting episode, I guess, that when we first started doing the learning environment SIG, me and Jenny, we had this idea of doing cafe conversations, right? And Jenny was the one that came and said, if we're going to do a cafe conversation, we have to have cafe music to start with. So it was really interesting because she was like planning at the beginning of the session, right, to set the scene with the cafe music on the background as people were arriving. And it was something that I never thought about it. But it's how the sound really sets the scene for what you want the learning space to be like, right?
I think that's really interesting. And in the sound map that I talked about, one of the clips there actually has some Scott Joplin playing, because one of the history tutors did just as you're talking about there, Lucila. He would choose a piece of music that had some significance to the American history lecture that was about to follow. So it was kind of fun, a nice gesture towards the students. But I would always go into the class early and I would see the students filter in, and it did bring a particular kind of ambience to the class, to the students walking into some ragtime jazz, and then of course the first slide appears. So there was something really, really nice about that. But I'm really interested in the in playlists, and I'm going to put a little link in to the chat here, because I started a project a number of years ago where I was interested in how students and researchers and educators were using sound and using music to inform their learning practices. So we created this project, and over the last 10 years, people have been sharing their learning playlists. So if Jenny, if you or any of your students would like to put together a learning playlist for that project, I'd love to hear.
Them. What topic do you want them on?
Fabulous, right? We'll discuss royalties and contracts after the session. I see that Mershin.
If you've got time for a question, can I ask it? Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much. This is really giving me so much to think about with regards to learning and how to sort of analyze the sonic environments and maybe even use it and more actively in education. You spoke a little bit around sound and music as display and power relationships more so, or at least it allows for you to analyze the nature of power within the education setting. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you negotiate your understanding of that when you look at sound and music as cultural phenomena. So it's not going to have a neutral point of reference, those sounds and the music, for example, your playlist that you might refer to. How is that as an educator? How do you negotiate that, then the notion of culture with regards to sound and music to address power relations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm conscious that I moved very, very quickly through what I was talking about there, and I'm also conscious that when I've presented this to some of the academic staff who were involved in my research, they were saying, we don't have those kinds of power hierarchies in our classroom. We work very closely with our students. So I gave a fairly simplistic overview of it. I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to reply. It's a really good question. I think I would have to think about it a bit more. I think what I would say is that when I was using sound, it was helping to reiterate other ideas that I was having about power dynamics and power hierarchies. And I make the point at the end about sound working in concert with other methods. The field recordings certainly helped me to see how the lecture had the power of voice and amplification within the American history course compared to the students, simply because students were audible through the typing of their keys as they recorded the knowledge, whereas the lecturer's voice was heard. However, I was also seeing things. I was sitting at the back of the lecture theatre, and I was looking down onto 300 students who could only face in one direction, who were static, who were seated, compared to the lecturer who was on a raised stage and had the power to walk around. And I'm also getting the sense that the power dynamic is also structured into that physical space, but it was amplified through the digital technologies, through the 12 ceiling speakers. And also, the same kind of conclusions came out through conversation when I was speaking to the American history tutors, and one quote particularly stayed with me, whereby the tutor was saying that, yes, of course, our students need to be working with the knowledge, they have to have their interpretation, but in a course where we're trying to convey hundreds of years of American history, a lot of this is about communicating a body of knowledge pretty effectively, pretty efficiently, and the lecture is a good way of doing that. And I think there's a really interesting comparison between learning spaces and place and sites of religion. And I cited the author in my thesis, but I don't have the name to hand, unfortunately. But they talked about how different sites of worship reflect different understandings of being and of our relationship with God. And they would talk about, if the traditional cathedral has the preacher or the bishop on this kind of raised, elevated space, but the cathedral is designed so that his voice would be projected all around. And he compared that with other forms of churches where it's flat. And I think that for me was really interesting, because without suggesting that the American history lecture was passing down tablets of knowledge from on high, there was a comparison there was a body of knowledge to be conveyed to the students, assisted by the sonic technologies, and in contrast within the design studio, where they have different assumptions about knowledge and about what learning is, and the tutors wouldn't assume that it's us passing down knowledge. We are there to provoke. It was this flat classroom, and the students and the tutors sat very close together. In actual fact, that was the only way the tutor could be heard amongst all the conversation, was to get really intimate and close to groups of students huddled together. So don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it's been of interest, Roshan.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm getting the fact that you're looking at it as a multimodal experience as well. Thanks.
That's correct, yeah.
I'm very conscious that we are sort of over the time. It has been really nice to have you, James. Thank you so much. I would like just to stay in the conversation for another half an hour at least, but I know that people have other commitments and other things, and you too. So thank you so much for coming today and talking to us. And I'm sure people can contact you and hear a little bit more about your research and tell a little bit more about their sort of the areas of expertise and how connect. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Please do get in touch if anybody has any questions. I'd love to hear from you.